So I'd like to begin today by wishing all of you good health and a big greetings from the Dunhuang Foundation. For many of you, I haven't had a chance to see you in person now for quite some time. For those that I was lucky enough to see in February and March, it seems like a really, really, really long time from where we are right now. But I'm very grateful that we have this opportunity to come together and to learn together and also celebrate China's history, as well as the very things that we as an organization pride ourselves on, which are preserving, Dunhuang's rather preserving and conserving Dunhuang's past, providing for its future, and also giving our participants a window into China today, as well as the ancient Silk Roads and Buddhism. This is a really fantastic lecture that we have today, and I feel really quite honored to introduce you to an up-and-coming scholar. She is a professor at Boston College, a graduate of Penn, and an art historian of China. Her particular focus is on the Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties, and she had a book that just came out, What the Emperor Built, Architecture and Empire in the Early Ming, which was published by the University of Washington Press just last month in June. And her talk today is going to illuminate some of the themes from that book, as well as speak a bit about the Imperial Collection. Before we go any further, I just want to remind everyone that if you have any questions or anything like that for our speaker today, there is a function right on the control panel. You'll see that it says Q&A. And you can go ahead and put in your questions there. The format for today's lecture is fairly simple. It's a 30-minute lecture by Aurelia Campbell. After that 30 minutes, we will have a Q&A period that'll be between 10 and 15 minutes, and then a 5-minute break. After that, Aurelia will join us once again, and she will conclude her lecture with an additional 30 minutes. The first portion speaks to the Forbidden City and its architecture in particular. And then for the second half, it will focus on the Imperial Art Collection. Again, I think this is a really fantastic lecture. We can't be traveling at the moment, as many of you know, but this is a way that we can come together and really have the opportunity to take part in some of these sites and learn about these sites, which we would be able to do in person, but in a really nuanced and interesting way, while also getting a chance to take part in new scholarship and to celebrate that. So without any further ado, I'm going to switch over to Aurelia. Aurelia is going to share her screen with you. She has a number of slides, and she's a pro at lecturing. She's gotten to be quite good at this, given that she's had to teach in a socially distanced fashion at BC for this semester. So again, without further ado, I introduce you to Aurelia Campbell. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Christian, and good evening, everybody. I would like to thank the Dunhuang Foundation, Kristen and Julia, for inviting me to speak tonight. As Kristen mentioned, the lecture today will be divided into two parts. So the first part will be on the Yongle Emperor and architecture of the Forbidden City, which is a subject near and dear to my heart because I just completed a book on it. And then the second half of the lecture will be on Qianlong and the Qianlong Emperor and art collecting in the Qing Dynasty. So let's get started. I'm going to, I guess it will be best if I minimize this so that we can see the slides better. So the Forbidden City Palace, which many of you have been to, is located in Beijing in China, and it was established in 1420. I use the word established rather than constructed because 1420 was the year that it was first built by the Yongle Emperor, but it has been rebuilt and modified throughout its history, throughout its 500-year history, and is still, in fact, being renovated and reconstructed and adapted in the modern period. So it's located, The palace is located in Beijing, which is the capital of China. It served as the imperial residence for emperors in the Ming Dynasty, which lasted from 1368 to 1644. So altogether, 20 emperors of the Ming Dynasty lived there. And it also served as the residence of the emperors for the Qing Dynasty. So the Qing Dynasty lasted from 1644 to 1911. And altogether, 12 or so Qing emperors resided within the Forbidden City. In addition to the emperors, the residents of the Forbidden City included their empresses, their concubines, their children, and then another class of people who are often left out of the picture, and that are the eunuchs. So the eunuchs are castrated men who basically served as the emperor's slaves. But hundreds of eunuchs lived and worked within the Forbidden City and served the emperor and his family. So when we think of the Forbidden City, it wasn't just these emperors, but it was a whole host of people that were part of, very close to him, part of his immediate network. So the Forbidden City was first built under the Yongle Emperor. So Yongle refers to his reign date. His name is Zhu Di. His last name is Zhu. His first name is Di. And he reigned from 1402 to 1424. So the Yongle Emperor is a very interesting character, a very unusual character. He's one of the most famous emperors in all of Chinese history. But he came to the throne in an unusual way. So his father, the Hongwu Emperor, Zhu Yuanzhang, was the first emperor of the Ming Dynasty. Zhu Yuanzhang established his dynasty, the Ming Dynasty, after the Yuan Dynasty, which was ruled by the Mongols. So Zhu Yuanzhang was the first emperor of the Ming Dynasty. When he founded the Ming, he moved the capital from Beijing, which had served as the capital under the Mongols, to Nanjing, which means the southern capital, further to the south. Zhu Yuanzhang, or the Hongwu Emperor, also enfiefed, he had 10 sons, and he enfiefed those sons in princely kingdoms all throughout his empire. And he enfiefed the future Yongle Emperor, Zhu Di, in what is now Beijing, which was the former Yuan Dynasty capital. And Yongle, as a prince, even lived in the former Yuan Dynasty palaces. So I always thought this must have given Yongle a great sense of grandeur, being able to live in the former Yuan palaces and rule from the former imperial capital. So Yongle was not chosen as the heir. In fact, Hongwu, his father, chose another one of his sons as the heir, but that son ended up dying early. So the throne was then passed to Hongwu's grandson, Yongle, and Yongle's nephew, who was the Jianwen, known as the Jianwen Emperor. Well, Yongle, of course, did not like that. Zhu Di did not like that. So he ended up usurping the throne from Jianwen after Jianwen had only been on the throne a few years. This was a multi-year process. It was a major civil war, and it ended in the slaughtering of Jianwen's closest family members, of his closest officials, and then also Yongle burnt down large sections, if not the whole palace in Nanjing. So one of Yongle's So Yongle was always haunted by his lack of legitimacy, and a lot of his great architectural and artistic endeavors, as well as many other cultural endeavors, like the great encyclopedia he sponsored, can at least in part be attributed to the fact that he always felt like he had to prove his legitimacy to rule, or that he had the mandate to rule, the heavenly mandate to rule. So Yongle, when he took the throne, he moved the capital up to the north, so back up to Beijing, where he had been enfiefed as a prince for at least, I think, close to 20 years before he ended up becoming emperor. So he was responsible for the construction of the capital city and the Forbidden City. So the capital in Beijing was constructed, the capital in Beijing as we know it of the Ming Dynasty was constructed between 1404 and 1420. So what we're looking at here is a map of all of the materials that Yongle sourced for his new capital. So he really went to great efforts to get some of the highest quality materials for his new capital. We can see that the stone and the ceramic tiles for the roofs were produced in and around Beijing. The gray brick used for pavers and walls, so for the flooring of exteriors and also walls, came from a city further south along the Grand Canal, and boats heading to Beijing, bringing grain to Beijing, were forced to also carry brick with them to the north. What was known as a gold brick, which wasn't actually gold, but rather a kind of dense, ceramic fired at a very high temperature, came from kilns in Suzhou, a town called Suzhou, also along the Grand Canal. These were called gold bricks, as I mentioned, not because they were gold, but rather because they were so expensive to make. They would have taken something like a year to make. So these were very special materials, construction materials, and they were used to pave the interiors of the grand halls. Now, the most important material of all, especially in the Yongle reign, was the timber used to build the palace halls. So Yongle went further and wider than any emperor had before him to seek out the best wood, the best timber for his imperial palaces. He sent officials in 1404, he sent several officials all over the country to look for wood, to look for the ideal wood for the halls. He didn't lay out criteria, but we can assume that they were looking for very large wood. What they found was a wood called nanmu and a tree called nanmu, which grows in the southwest of China. So you can see it marked on the map here. And these trees come from old growth forests. They take 100 or 200 years to grow to the size that Yongle desired. And hundreds of thousands of trees were chopped during Yongle's reign to create the palaces and other ritual buildings in Beijing. So you can see the main spots where the nanmu was harvested on this map. Later, as we move through time, these main areas become deforested. And so eventually, as we'll talk about in a minute, people could no longer create or build out of nanmu. So this was a massive, massive undertaking. Thousands of people died in the process of trying to get this wood. This whole region that looks, very mild on this map here is actually full of poisonous snakes and tigers and bandits and huge cliffs, ravines, all of these huge, heavy trees, massive logs that needed like 30 people to drag had to be hauled up and down ravines. So this, again, was a huge project. So it took 2 or 3 years for these logs to get to the capital. You see in this slide some images of the types of things I was just talking about. On the left, we see the so-called gold bricks, which were used for the interiors. On the upper right, you see yellow or gold glazed roof tiles, which are symbolic of the emperor. And then we also see these particular tiles stamped with dragons, another symbol of the emperor. And then on the bottom right, we see a close-up of the so-called golden thread nanmu. So the grain of the nanmu was said to look like golden silk thread. And I think this image conveys that very clearly. So we're going to move inside the Forbidden City, of course, because the Forbidden City was inhabited for the next 500 years. A lot of the landscape has changed. The basic contours of the palace remain from the Yongle reign. So what I mean by that is this rectilinear layout surrounded by a moat. This was laid down in the Yongle period. It's also surrounded by a high wall. The other thing that's remained intact from the Yongle period is that all all the main buildings, all the largest buildings and important ceremonial buildings unfold along the central axis. These individual buildings have been rebuilt over time, but their layout remains the same from the Yongle period. This area too is consistent with Yongle design. So I don't have time to go into it here, but suffice to say, if you read the chapter I assigned, you learned that the basic model for the Forbidden City came from Hongwu, Yongle's father's palace in Nanjing. So Yongle basically took that model and moved it to Beijing. This allowed him to form a sense of continuity with his father, and also claim that he, yet again claim that he was the legitimate heir, symbolically through architecture. So the palace is entered through the Meridian Gate. This is a massive and imposing structure. It's meant to be massive and imposing. It's elevated on a rammed earth platform. What I mean by rammed earth is literally that thousands of craftsmen would have tamped earth, pounded it down so that it became very solid, a very solid structure, and then faced it with brick. And then the buildings on top of it now date to the Qing dynasty, but there would have originally been Ming style buildings on top from which guards would stand, armed guards to protect the interior. So the main kind of the heart of the Forbidden City and the main political center, not just of the palace, but of the whole empire, was this area that is marked in red. So this is a massive courtyard. You can see it in this photograph I took here. You can see this photograph I took off from the side. If you were standing on the central axis, the north-south central axis, this would have been framed directly. The Hall of Supreme Harmony, this building here, would be framed directly in front of you. So this massive courtyard here is interesting. It's a space that's often neglected in studies of the architecture of the Forbidden City, but it was actually a space that was used quite frequently. And it was used for major ceremonies. So here we see a 19th century, so much later than the Yongle period, but still important. We see a 19th century painting of the wedding of the Guangxu Emperor. So we're in the Qing dynasty here. So you can see the Hall of Supreme Harmony to the right in the backdrop of the building. And then in front of it on the marble platform, and then extending, we can imagine, all the way into this huge courtyard here, are officials. And as we see, the officials are very organized in a very orderly fashion. So they're organized according to their rank. And we can see that they're organized according to their rank because they all wear different colors. So their rank is color coded. Their rank is also signified by these various insignia and banners and other accoutrements of rank and power that they hold. Some are on horseback. And then we see this very neat kind of symmetrical balance. This is a semi-fictionalized, but based on reality, example of how this space in the front courtyard was used is shown in the movie The Last Emperor, which was actually one of the only foreign films allowed to be filmed in the Forbidden City. So this is not a set, it's actually, we're looking at the Forbidden City here. And the scene being depicted here is the eventual coronation of the last emperor when he was just a child of the Qing dynasty. And you can see all of these officials kneeling in their proper garb in this space, so this grand ceremonial space. So what's interesting to me is that the rank is actually marked in the architecture of the floor of the large courtyard. So you can see here, for instance, these pavers have been set at equal distances. So these would have been cues for where the officials should stand. There were more deliberate but temporary cues in these things, which are rank markers. So for those of you who can read Chinese, you can see that this is an official of the 9th rank would have stood here. You see two scripts here, by the way. One is Chinese and the other is Manchu. The Qing dynasty emperors were Manchu. And so they had used their own script for official documents. And that's why all over the Forbidden City, you'll see both Chinese and all the plaques and other kind of official signage is written in both Chinese and Manchu scripts. So moving on now to this great hall that serves as the backdrop for these big ceremonies, and also the setting of the main event of the ceremonies, whether it's the wedding or the coronation. So this building is now called the Hall of Supreme Harmony. It was last reconstructed in 1695 during the Qing dynasty. So it's still one of the largest pre-modern buildings in China, if not the largest. I've seen conflicting accounts, but in any case, it's a very, very, very large wooden, timber frame building with a ceramic tile roof. It was originally called the Hall of Revering Heaven when it was constructed in the Yongle reign. So we remember that Yongle usurped the throne. He was always anxious about that. I mean, anxious is definitely an understatement. He was totally paranoid. So building Beijing and building the Forbidden City was a big symbol for him, was a massive gesture to show that this is it, I did this, I am the legitimate emperor. So when the Forbidden City and Beijing was officially completed, he made a big statement. You know, I think he even stood on the top of these stairs and projected to his officials, you know, announced to his officials that the completion of the capital, he announced the completion of the capital to his officials. You know, he dined them in this hall. This hall kind of became the center stage of, you know, representing the culmination of this grand 20-year architectural project. But not 4 months after he had announced the completion, lightning struck the hall and it burnt, and it was unusable. Now, of course, for Yongle, who did not come to the throne legitimately, this was a massive, massive blow because it signaled to him that heaven did not approve of his reign after all. So the hall was not rebuilt until a couple decades later. Throughout its history, it was rebuilt, I think 5 times total, each time being either destroyed by fire or an earthquake. So the original building was much larger than we see here. Scholars, including me, have tried to figure out exactly how large it was. And that's kind of an impossible question, but it would have been wider for sure. It probably would have extended, you know, to here, around here, and here. It probably would have been around the same height and the same depth. But in any case, it was a larger and grander structure than we see today. And today's building is huge. So the interior of the Hall of Supreme Harmony looks like this today. This is very typical Qing dynasty, very Rococo, very ornate, every surface colored, lots of use of gold, brightly painted. But in the Ming dynasty under Yongle, the interior of the hall probably would have looked something like this. So what we're looking at here is the interior of the only building from the Yongle period where we can still see Nanmu. So this hall is located at Yongle's tomb, which is called Chang'an, and it's north of Beijing. It's about an hour north of Beijing. So you can see here the size of the Nanmu columns. In this particular picture, it looks like 4 little girls are wrapping their arms around one. So these are massive columns. Each one would have been a whole tree of Nanmu. And you can imagine that originally all the halls in the Forbidden City would have been built with these massive columns. And there's just a much more kind of austere aesthetic. Of course, this is a ritual structure, a part of a tomb, so maybe that also accounts for some of its austerity. But I think it's safe to say that the Ming aesthetic would have been a lot more understated than what we see in the Qing here. Also, this Qing dynasty interior obscures an interesting fact, and that is that these columns are not made out of a single trunk of wood. They're also not made out of Nanmu. By that time, there was no Nanmu left. So, I mean, there was Nanmu left. It's not like the forests were completely devoid, but there were not large enough columns to create something like this. There just were not large enough trees growing close to the waterways. They tried to get Nanmu, they failed. So Kangxi, who undertook the last reconstruction of this hall, instead ordered them to use pine for the reconstruction. Here we see a diagram of how the columns were made out of the pine wood, which is, the pine is much thinner. So you can see here that they had to make composite columns with a tall, thin trunk of pine wrapped by a bunch of other smaller pieces of wood. And then here you can see that the whole construction has been obscured. It's wrapped in gold, covered with dragons. And then here it's wrapped in hemp and then covered with red lacquer. So presenting the idea that these are whole columns, and yet they're not, they're actually composite columns. So on the top of the ceiling here, which you've probably been noticing in the image I keep showing, is what's called a zaojing in Chinese, or a coffered ceiling. These are common in Buddhist temples and palaces, but the one in this hall is particularly extraordinary. So it basically serves as a symbolic canopy. So umbrellas or canopies or parasols have a long history association with royalty. I mean, especially in Buddhism. So not just in Buddhism, but you see it in Buddhism. So this is a symbolic and now stylized canopy, which would have symbolically protected the throne beneath it. The throne itself is also very elaborate. So we see that the throne comprised not just the seat itself, but also a footrest, and also this magnificent screen behind it. This was true of all thrones within the Forbidden City. They have these three parts. The frame here, the screen here acts as a frame. So you can imagine if the emperor were sitting in front of it, he would be beautifully framed by this screen. It also, we can think of these screens in terms of feng shui as well, because it would have symbolically blocked malevolent forces from the north. So it's like a shield or a screen. And then it's also, of course, a wonderful surface for decoration. So here's an image from another still from the movie The Last Emperor, with the young Puyi seated atop the dragon throne. So we can see all this dragon symbolism too. So we're moving now towards the rear of the platform. As you descend off the three-tier marbled base, you have to walk past this, it's a so-called marble carpet, because it looks like a marble carpet. I mean, the name's, the derivation of the name is kind of obvious. So the emperor would have been carried over this so-called marble carpet. That's why we have staircases on either side. These stones were so heavy that they could only be transported by floating them, sliding them across ice in winter. So they had to wait till winter to transport, when they first built this, they had to wait till winter to transport the big blocks of marble and then wet the ground and then slide these stones across the ice. So if you look closely, you can't even see any seams. It's just wonderfully crafted. So it just looks like this seamless carpet that's been unfurled down the great staircase. There's more symbolism. There's symbolism all over the Forbidden City, but this is just yet another example. These 5 mountain peaks represent the emperor. They represent the 4 directions, north, south, east, west, and then the emperor at the center. You see this imagery also in Korean, a lot of Korean imperial art, such as we see here. So the emperor is the central mountain at the center of the universe. Okay, in the last few minutes, we are going to move into the inner court. So the inner court is where the emperor resided. So the outer court is where he conducted his political affairs. The inner court is where he resided and where the palace women resided as well. What I'm mostly interested in here is this building at the very rear of the central axis. So you can see that this is in the northernmost position along the north-south central axis. So it's definitely in a position of importance. So what is it? Well, it's also in this nice shady garden, which is unusual. It's a temple. It's a temple called the Hall of Imperial Peace, and it's dedicated to the Taoist deity Zhenwu. So it was established under Yongle, and it's been reconstructed since. This is notably the only building in in Yongle's palace plan that did not have a counterpart in Nanjing. So this was the only new building that he added. So why did he add it? Well, first of all, to answer that, we have to see who the temple is dedicated to. It's dedicated to this deity right here who's enshrined inside. Here's the elaborate interior of the hall. This deity is called Dunhuang. Dunhuang is also known as he's a martial god. He is associated with the north, which is probably why Yongle chose to place the temple in the very north of the imperial palace. But he is also, Yongle kind of chose him as his personal deity. And the Yongle court even generated this kind of story that Dunhuang had aided Yongle in his usurpation of the throne. So as the story goes, when Yongle was engaged in an attack against his nephew, Dunhuang appeared in the sky before him and, somehow gave him the confidence or helped him win the battle. So what's interesting is that, first of all, he dedicated a whole temple to Dunhuang within the Forbidden City. And then also, we're going to leave the Forbidden City for a minute to travel far outside to the center of the country, to Mount Wudang. So Mount Wudang in Hubei province is closely associated with Dunhuang. It is said to be the site where it's basically the earthly abode of Dunhuang, or where this deity was said to have practiced Taoism for 40 years before he became a deity. So Yongle knew about the associations between Wudang and Dunhuang, and simultaneously, while he was constructing the Forbidden City and the palaces in Beijing, he was also engaging in a massive, large-scale construction of a bunch of temples dedicated to Dunhuang on Mount Wudang. So this is an image of the gorgeous and expansive Wudang mountain range. So you can also see how steep and difficult this terrain is. And also, it's not just one tiny mountain peak. This is a huge mountain range. So trying to construct imperial buildings here versus trying to construct them in Beijing is a much more difficult problem. But of course, Yongle, undaunted, did it. He sent 200,000 craftsmen to this area. That's the same number of craftsmen who was involved in the construction of Beijing, or close to it, kind of the main craftsmen involved. Upwards of 1 million subsidiary craftsmen were involved in Beijing. But he sent hundreds of thousands of craftsmen here. He built dozens of temples in the imperial style, the same architectural style we see in Beijing. And what you're looking at here is a building he constructed on the very highest peak of the whole mountain range. So this peak is important because it was said to be the place where Dunhuang, after he had practiced Taoism on Mount Wudang for 40 years, he climbed to the top of this peak and then ascended to the heavens and then became the deity that we know him as today. So Yongle wanted to honor Dunhuang and the site of his ascendancy. And so he constructed this building that we see here. Originally, this would have been alone. These were added in the Qing dynasty. He also built this wall around the peak. So we see this wall with 4 gates, just like the Forbidden City, entered through 4 gates. The only gate that you can actually enter is from the south, also like the Forbidden City. And Yongle even referred to this as a kind of impenetrable wall, a Forbidden City. So this wall is from the Yongle reign, and it protected the Golden Hall at the top. So let's take a closer look at this Golden Hall. It's a really incredible building, dates right to the Yongle period, was not really reconstructed as much as many timber buildings we see, because it wasn't made of timber, it was made of brass. And you might be wondering how they got a small scale brass hall all the way up that massive mountain peak, which by the way would take a week to climb to the top of, weeks to get there. Well, they fabricated all the parts of it individually, much like just as you would fabricate the timber members of a timber building. And then they fabricated them in Nanjing, and then they shipped them by boat to the mountain. And then they hauled the parts, the individual parts up the mountain, and then they assembled it on site. So this was made in a bunch of parts that were assembled right on the mountain. This fence, by the way, was added later. It's now kind of a dominant characteristic of the hall, but it was added later. The interior of the Golden Pavilion also contains a statue of Zhenwu, which was created in Nanjing and sent to the mountain. So it's a statue of Zhenwu and his attendants. So eventually Yongle and Zhenwu became conflated in popular narratives. So a lot of mythology, post-Yongle period mythology, saw Zhenwu and Yongle as kind of one and the same. So this is an interesting after effect of Yongle's massive construction project. And we also see the Mount Wudang project and the Beijing Forbidden City project as being considered counterparts. So there are sayings on Mount Wudang, for instance, if you've gone to Mount Wudang, you don't need to go to the Forbidden City. So this was kind of the twin architectural project in which Yongle was engaged while he was constructing Beijing and the Forbidden City, and few people know about it. So I thought I'd bring it in here. All of this, by the way, is discussed in the book that, as Kristen mentioned, my book just came out a couple weeks ago. So if you're interested in reading more, you can do that here. Okay, so I'll stop now, and maybe we can answer some questions.
Hello, Aurelia.
Hi.
Hey, so we have got some great questions that have been coming in while you've been lecturing. I want to thank you. That was excellent. I learned a lot. I thought I knew a fair deal about the Forbidden City, and it turns out there's a lot I did not know. So thank you for elucidating all that.
You're welcome.
The first question we received was, we were wondering, at that time, were there no timber sources closer to Beijing than southwestern China? Was this already an example of deforestation?
There were places closer, but Yongle actually sent officials to various regions of the country. One was to the southwest where the Nanmu was, and then others went to other parts of the country where they knew forests were, but there weren't big enough timbers, or at least big enough timbers for Yongle's taste. So he wanted the biggest and the best, apparently. But yeah, like building, Nanmu was not a very common construction material prior to the Yongle reign. So yes, there were forests in other parts of China, and those had been used, other types of wood had been used for building for years. But Yongle really pioneered this, the use of Nanmu in imperial construction. And in fact, after Yongle, every time one of these imperial buildings burnt down, the emperors would like rush to go send people to get Nanmu. So every time after, so Nanmu then became the imperial standard. So that's kind of, yeah. So that's an interesting thing to note too. It wasn't really considered the imperial wood before that time, but afterwards, every imperial building had to be Nanmu. The problem was eventually there wasn't enough Nanmu wood to do that.
To sustain this kind of association between imperial construction and this one very special type of wood.
Yeah, exactly. Or I should clarify that it was there, it just wasn't anywhere near the waterways. So you have reports of officials being sent and they're like, the Nanmu is there, we just can't get to it. There's no way. We tried for like 6 months and we can't get it. So it's not like they deforested the whole landscape, but the big trees next to the waterways were pretty much gone by the mid-Ming.
Okay, our second question is, your reading points out the Forbidden City is copied from Nanjing, but we're also often told the Qing copied the Forbidden City from their capital at Shenyang. So could you clarify this? Oh,
well, I mean, I don't know about that second claim, so I would have to see the specific reference. As I mentioned, the basic, the main buildings along the central axis, the 6 palaces in the back where the palace women lived, and then the basic parameters of the Forbidden City, into the dimensions, I guess, are all from the Yongle reign. But during the Qing dynasty, a lot of it changed. Qianlong in particular, who we're going to discuss in a minute, he added gardens, he added palaces. And in order to add those things, he had to tear other buildings down. I mean, I haven't studied enough of that would be a whole separate project, but enough of kind of the history of the Forbidden City, you know, trace like a timeline of like what building existed here when was it torn down to really grasp all that totally. But I do know that new buildings were added. For instance, Qianlong added a lot of Tibetan Buddhist temples that we don't see in the Yongle reign or for most of the Ming. He also added gardens and some, you know, other kinds of retirement palaces, which we'll talk about in a minute. So certainly the you know, parts of the Forbidden City were adapted and renovated over time, but the basic structure is from
the layout.
So I don't know. I'd have to see the information about Shenyang.
Okay. Our next question is, can you elaborate on the features of the new imperial architecture style that emerged during the Ming? How different was this from the Tang style, for instance?
Sure. So first of all, for those of you who have not read the chapter I assigned, this new Ming architectural style is basically something we start to see in Yongle's architecture. It could have existed in the architecture of his father, but we don't have enough of architecture from the Hongwu reign because Nanjing basically burnt down to really have a good enough kind of case study. So, you know, basically we can conclude that at least by the Yongle reign, there was a new Ming architectural style. Why did it develop? Well, I suspect it developed because there was so much building in the first 50 years of the Ming. They built a whole capital in Nanjing. There was a second, Yongle's father built another capital that he abandoned after a while in what's now Fengyang and Anhui in his hometown. That was the central capital, but he abandoned that. Then Beijing was built. So craftsmen were just like going crazy building 3 different capitals in 50 years. I mean, that's insane. So I have the sense that they needed to work out, that they needed to erect buildings quickly and efficiently. So I would say in direct response to the question, one of the main kind of distinctive feature of the new Ming imperial architectural style is that the timber frame, the timber structure is a lot more simplified and standardized than it had been in in Tang architecture and Song architecture and even Yuan dynasty architecture. So you see, for instance, the bracket sets, those components that transfer the weight of the heavy ceramic tiled roofs onto the pillars, those become just regular. In the Tang dynasty, you had all sort of different beautiful shapes. They look like flowers. They were huge and ornate. By the Ming, they just get much smaller and kind of regular. You know, there are a number of other principles we see, like you only have one intercolumnar set. So overall, this new Ming architectural style is rank was clearly communicated through aspects of the building. So it was a much simplified and more standardized style than the Tang, which was you know, prettier buildings in a lot of ways, but would have taken a lot more creativity and effort to make.
So the Ming became progressively more modular and just more like systematic, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so we have another excellent question here. Could you please share with us 1 or 2 particular challenges in your researching of the planning and construction of Yongle's Beijing?
I mean, I think the main one was related to the last question, was trying to work out this new architectural style, because in the Song dynasty, as some of you may know, there's a state-sponsored architectural manual called the Yingzao Fashi. It was published in 1103, and that kind of summarizes a lot of the architecture that came before it. And you know, it's basically a way to regulate for the state to regulate construction. to economize materials and that kind of thing, and to understand like how fast you could build a building if you had so many workers, all that kind of thing. So we know a lot about Song Dynasty architecture from that manual. Song Dynasty architecture has been relatively well studied. Qing Dynasty architecture, the Qing court also sponsored a government construction manual. So we also know quite a bit about architecture from the Qing Dynasty from that, although it's been less well studied than the Song. But for the Ming Dynasty, there's no government-sponsored construction manual. So all we have are these buildings. We don't even know how to refer to the parts of them. Like, are we supposed to use the Song terms, or are we supposed to use the Qing terms? Right. We can definitely see a kind of development towards Qing architecture in some aspects, but it's not fully developed. So trying to work out, or trying to at least, I can't say I worked it out entirely, but at least trying to propose some convincing arguments for, first of all, trying to kind of create a definition of what this new Ming architectural style is and why it came about was really hard. It took a few years of work, honestly, trying to synthesize all that, because it just has to come from the buildings themselves. So you have to look at a lot of data.
There's no standardized terminology. Like the Qing, everything is just like laid out so systematically.
Yeah, and in the Qing you have, the names for things. So when I was writing my book, I'm like, should I use the Song terms or the Qing terms? I think I use kind of a mix of them, but it's also hard to know what to refer to certain component parts. Right. But it's also just, nothing's spelled out for you. You just have to look at the buildings. And I mean, Chinese scholars before me, I didn't survey any buildings because you need like special permissions, and you have to get inside the roof frame and all that. So I relied on data from Chinese architectural teams. A lot of Ming buildings have been surveyed by Tianjin University. Oh, okay. So I relied on a lot of their data, but it's still like a lot of numbers that you have to, I'm not a number person, an art history person, but all of a sudden this was like some mathematical puzzle that I had to solve. So I would say that was the most challenging aspect.
Okay. Well, we have one question.
Okay.
Final one. Hi, Aurelia. Are there any Nanmu thrones or screens left?
Probably. Actually, very likely. I'm not sure. Maybe that one that I was showing is Nanmu, actually. I'm not sure. The reason I say likely is that there's a lot of small scale Nanmu stuff, lots of Nanmu furniture, lots of Nanmu stuff. You could make, the problem was finding the big timbers. But I would say undoubtedly there are some Nanmu thrones, and maybe even the one I showed, but that's a great question that I should probably be able to answer. But yeah, Nanmu trees, Nanmu stuff is still being made, because you just don't, the problem is having to wait 200 years for trees to grow the size of those massive columns we saw at the sacrificial hall at his tomb. Otherwise, you can just cut down small trees and make furniture and thrones and all that small scale stuff.
Okay, so it's mostly the columns that are the main issue when you have to take into consideration.
A lot of the beams, because then you have to cut the beams into a square section too, so you're losing a lot of wood, so you have to start with the column.
Okay.
Or huge truck.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I think that's the end of our questions. Okay. So if we don't have any further, I guess it's time to call a 5-minute break. This will be our intermission, and we'll rejoin everyone back in 5 minutes. That should be 6:56 or so Central Time.
Okay, great. See you all in 5 minutes.
See you in 5.
Hello again, everybody. I've been given the signal to start, so I will go ahead and share this. All right. So for the second half of the lecture today, we're going to be discussing a topic that is is not one I just wrote a book on, so be easy on me. But this is something I teach a lot in my seminar on the Forbidden City. It's also, I hope, interesting to you. I wanted to do something, I wanted the first half of the class to be about, or the lecture to be about architecture, and then the second to focus on objects. And when discussing objects in the Forbidden City, there's no better reign on which to focus, in my mind, than the reign of the Qianlong Emperor. So we're gonna discuss his art collections and also the imperial art that some of the imperial art that he sponsored in his reign. So it'd be totally impossible to discuss even, you know, 100th of the works of art that Qianlong commissioned during his long reign. So he ruled during what's called the High Qing, usually, just because it's known as such a period of cultural florescence. And he ruled from 1735 to 1796. So most of the entire 18th century. He had one of the second to longest reign of any emperor in the history of China, only overshadowed by his grandfather. But Qianlong actually deliberately ended his rule rather than outlast his grandfather, the Kangxi Emperor's illustrious long reign. So Qianlong, you see his portrait here, was just, I can't even say, a madman when it came to his engagements with art and architecture. So Wu Hong, a very prominent Chinese art historian, has summarized Qianlong's attitude towards art in the following ways. So first, Qianlong had to physically possess the art. So largely because of his efforts, thousands and thousands of paintings, porcelain, and jades entered the Forbidden City, along with many other types of art. Second, he had to leave his personal marks on all these works. So not only did he cover the ancient paintings with his writings, but he also ordered his poems and seals to be engraved on antique jades. And then finally, he had to literally embody these works by depicting himself within them. So Harold Kahn, a Qing Dynasty scholar, once wrote that for Qianlong, the most egocentric aspect of the emperor's lust for collection or collecting was the collecting of himself. So we can think about what that might mean. I'm trying to set all this also within the Forbidden City. One of Qianlong's favorite spaces within the Forbidden City was this area marked in red here. So this is in the inner courtyard of the Imperial Palace. And it's a palace, it's a space called the Hall of Mental Cultivation. So originally in Yongli's reign and through the Ming and through the first part of the Qing, the emperor's residence was here in this large building here. But that was big and it was uncomfortable. And Qianlong's father, the Yongzheng emperor, instead made his main residence here because it was smaller and more comfortable. So it was known as the Hall of Mental Cultivation. And at least the main part of it looked like this. So you can see it was divided into 3 sections with a throne room and a library in the center. To the right, an area heated, that's known as the warm chamber because it's heated by something called a kang, which is basically a raised platform with a brazier underneath that could be heated nice and toasty with charcoal. And then on the left, the room of the 3 rarities. So the room of the 3 rarities was where Qianlong spent a lot of time. And that is also a space where he really engaged with his art collecting. So here's an image of the room of the 3 rarities as it looks today. You can see that there are glass windows and other kinds of things added after Qianlong. But you can imagine the emperor would have, really liked to sit on top of this heated, here's an example of the heated kang here, in this quiet, kind of, intimate space and compose poetry, inscribe his works of art, hold his works of art, these kinds of things. So on the right, we see a portrait of Qianlong actually dressed as a typical Chinese literatus. We know, I mentioned already that the Qing emperors were Manchu. So this is kind of a cosplay or a costume portrait in which he's dressing up as this scholar. Here he is stroking his beard, deep in thought, with his hand poised ready on the brush and a blank slate in front of him as if he's about to start composing something. So you can imagine he would have done these kinds of things depicted in the painting within the Room of Three Rarities. As Wu Hong just mentioned, Qianlong really liked to paint himself in paintings, and he often he commissioned himself to be painted. He didn't paint these himself, but he often had himself painted surrounded by objects in his collection. And here's a really interesting example of him doing that. So a lot of these artifacts that are depicted here, I'm thinking of this one in particular, which is a blue and white vase from, I think it was in his father's collection, and this has Tibetan or Sanskrit letters all over it. But in any case, all of these objects here were objects Qianlong owned. So he had his actual, some of his favorite things painted within the portrait here. Here he is in the center, sitting on the couch bed, accompanied by an attendant. This was kind of conventional trope in paintings like this. Behind him is a screen. So this screen functions in the same way as the screens in the more formal throne rooms. It acts as a frame to frame the emperor. It acts as a kind of block from everything behind him. And then it's also a surface for decoration. So the decoration in this case on the screen is a landscape painting, so a monochromatic landscape painting. And the style is characteristic of an artist called Nizan, who lived in the Song dynasty. We also have another portrait hanging from the top of the screen, and that's another portrait of Qianlong. So the Qianlong the Qianlong who's seated here is looking towards the portrait of Qianlong, looking down on him. So they're kind of engaged in this dialogue. There's another fascinating aspect to this painting, and that is we can be clued into it by this word tieluo, which is translated here as a fixed hanging. What this refers to is a type of painting. This is a very large painting. So I don't know the exact dimensions. Sorry, I don't have them for you here, but Qianlong probably would have been life size here, or close to it, or maybe half life size. But in any case, this is a large painting because it would have been pasted on a wall. So it's painted on silk or paper, but then a special type of glue, kind of like a Post-it note glue or something, that would allow it to be affixed to a wall, but then also taken down sometimes, was used. So this painting here would be affixed to a surface much like this screen. So you can imagine that if this was mounted on a screen, then the actual Qianlong could be actually seated in front of a screen that depicted him sitting in front of a screen looking at another portrait of himself. Now the final aspect of this painting is the poem inscribed on the top, which it's too complicated to go into here now, and I never fully grasp it anyway, but it starts with the term shi shar, but that means here, is it one or is it two? So is it one or is it two? And he's talking about Buddhist concepts of non-duality here, so different aspects of the self. So this is a good entree into Qianlong's kind of style of art patronage and art making. He, in commissioning this painting, is working in a long genre of tradition in Chinese painting where scholars had themselves depicted among their art collections, admiring the works of art in their collection. So here's one from the Ming Dynasty, Elegant Gathering of the Apricot Garden. We have another Ming Dynasty one by Qiu Ying, ranking ancient works in a bamboo courtyard. So in here we see these scholars sitting in front of their screen, identifying these are ancient bronzes from the Shang and Zhou periods that, have by this time had been dug up through archaeology and collected. So Qianlong owned these paintings or paintings like them. They would have been in his imperial collection. So he's following in this vein. He also made deliberate references to at least 2 other paintings. One is this one, which was in the imperial collection, painted by an anonymous scholar with a portrait, which is dated to the Song or the Ming. Sorry, this is the best quality I could get of it. But here we can see, that he deliberately copied the composition here of the scholar, facing his portrait, which is hanging behind him. The painting on the bottom, the portrait of Nizan, the reference is a little more subtle. So Nizan is the painter I just mentioned. He was a famous painter, sorry, not a Song painter, he's a Yuan dynasty painter. So Nizan lived during the Yuan dynasty, and he painted in this very kind of insipid, bland style that's easily recognizable. A lot of like empty huts and kind of barren landscapes. So here is Nizan sitting in front of his own portrait. And Qianlong has referenced Nizan and referenced this whole painting by painting himself in front of a Nizan painting. So anytime you approach a work of art produced in the Qianlong reign, whether it's it's something secular like this, or whether it's Buddhist or what, there are many, many, many layers of meaning. So everything he created was very complex and multivalent. This is another example. Here is a hanging scroll depicting Qianlong, again surrounded by his collections and looking at art. So this painting was created by Giuseppe Castiglione. He was not Chinese, as you might guess. He was an Italian Jesuit working at the Qing court. He's very famous. Many of you may have heard his name before, but he was also very prolific. So he created many, many, many paintings at the Qing court, and especially the Qianlong court. So he was a favorite of Qianlong, and Qianlong hired him, or hired is probably not the best word, but had Castiglione paint a lot of portraits of him and many, many, many other works of art for him. And then this was a collaboration between Castiglione and Ding Guangpeng, who is a Chinese court artist. So what we see here is Qianlong again surrounded by his collections and lots of attendants, and in front of him there's been this painting unfurled, and you can see his line of sight doesn't exactly look at the painting, it kind of looks down, but the reason is because the artists wanted to show this whole painting. So why did they want to go to the efforts of showing this whole painting for us? Well, because that's where the cleverness of the painting lies. So the painting we're looking at within this painting is an actual painting that was owned by Qianlong. So the painting that we're seeing here is this one. And this was painted by a famous Ming Dynasty painter called Ding Yunpeng. The relation between Ding Guangpeng and Ding Yunpeng is just a coincidence, even though their names sound similar. The painting is titled Washing an Elephant. So what we see here is was kind of a common theme even before Ding Yunpeng, this theme of washing an elephant. It's a Buddhist reference. So this person seated here is probably a bodhisattva, either Samantabhadra. Samantabhadra is associated with elephants, rides an elephant. I've also seen this person identified as Manjushri. In any case, it's again complex because the word for elephant in Chinese, xiang, also is pronounced the same as the word for image. So there's this idea that there are play kind of between form, an actual elephant and an image of an elephant that Qianlong's kind of working with here. And then the people here are engaged in the cleaning of an elephant. So, this has some complex meaning about the nature of form and the changing nature of form. But we can see here that Qianlong has taken this painting, not only incorporated it, that he owned in his collection, not only incorporated it into his own painting, but also the artist created a similar composition. So you see this circular composition of attendants And in this case, Qianlong, it's mirror image, but Qianlong would be the bodhisattva. So Qianlong is also somehow associated with himself with the bodhisattva through the placement. And then the image, the painting would be the actual image, not the actual elephant, but they're pronounced the same, Xiang. So again, many layers of meaning, very complicated interpretations, lots of fun trying to interpret these things. You never fully, I think, quite feel like you can, which I think was part of Qianlong's the fun he had in all of this. So we're moving on now, not to depictions of Qianlong, but the type of art collecting he practiced. So this is a very famous painting called Dwelling in the Fuchun Mountains, created in 1350 during the Yuan dynasty by a painter called Huang Gongwang. So this is the whole hand scroll up above, and then this is a detail of the first scene. So you can see some of the incredible brushwork here. Well, Qianlong owned a copy of this painting, which was a Ming Dynasty copy. So in China, it was common for copies to be made of paintings. So Qianlong really liked this painting, and he also wanted to go to the Fuchun, and he liked it so much that when he made his imperial inspection tour, he made some tours to the south during his reign. He took the painting with him, and he traveled to the Fuchun Mountains, and he recorded in poems and other kinds of inscriptions his impressions of the Fuchun Mountains right on the painting, literally, right on top of the Ming Dynasty painting. So every blank space now is basically filled up with Qianlong's poetry and his impressions of the landscape in which he visited. So he did similar things with other paintings. This is a painting by the famous Yuan Dynasty painter Zhao Mengfu called Sheep and Goat. And this is another, of course, painting in the Imperial collection. Here, Qianlong did not so much inscribe his poetry, but rather he stamped it with a ton of his imperial seals. So a lot of these seals you see here are from Qianlong's reign. So there were eight standard seals that he stamped on top of this. The seal of subtle assessment in the studio of 3 rarities, suitable for sons and grandsons, assessed in the Qianlong era, assessment of the Stone Moat Pavilion, new compilation of precious collections. So all of these seals refer to either the places where he assessed the work of art, or some of the collections in which he, the painting collection, like catalogs, in which he thought this painting should belong. So his interactions with the works of art in his collection were also often, ways for him to kind of classify his art, to authenticate his art, to show that he had interacted with the works of art in his collection. So he was a real kind of connoisseur. He did this not just with paintings, but with ceramics and jades and many, many, many other things. I'll just show you 2 more examples. This is a Song Dynasty ceramic with a celadon glaze, beautiful ceramic dish. And Qianlong on the bottom, as we can see on the right, inscribed this too. So what he said was, the Zhao Song Dynasty celadons established the reputation of Ru Prefecture. According to legend, agate was added to the glaze. The Jingdezhen kilns of today, those are the Qing imperial kilns, do not adopt this method, but are still able to produce the marvelous sky blue on their own. So here he's really revealing and showing off his art historical awareness. He knows, for instance, that in the Song Dynasty, celadons from Ru were very important. In that area, they added agate to the glaze, but he also knows that this is not how celadons are produced in his own imperial kilns. So he's really showing off what he knows about Chinese art history, as well as leaving his mark on these works of art. So we see here's a dingware dish, so a similar dish to the Ruware, but a different type, also a celadon, and here he also writes, on its bare unglazed rims alone, Dingware is not liked, but the secret ware of the Southern Song official kilns is highly treasured. It stands alone in the world, rarely seen, and although blemished, the connoisseur's desire is still very keen. So there's this sense that this unglazed rim here, he can tell, you know, how fine it is, how fine the ceramic, the ware is because of that. All right, so we may ask ourselves, is Qianlong enhancing or effacing the art in his collection by doing this? I mean, I think this is just kind of something to think about, because different people have different opinions, and you know, obviously there's probably a bit of truth to both the sides. Okay, for the last few minutes, we're going to look at another favorite place of Qianlong in the Forbidden City. By the way, Qianlong didn't really like the Forbidden City in general. By that time, the Qing emperors had built summer palaces, and he much preferred spending time in the summer palaces. So when I say he loved these spaces within the Forbidden City, they were just the places that he seemed to spend the most time within the Forbidden City, but he actually in general did not spend that much time in the Forbidden City. So this is located in the upper right, or the northeast corner of the palace. And it's known as the Palace of Tranquility and Longevity. It was constructed between 1771 and 1776 for Qianlong's mother as a retirement villa. But a small slice of this area is called the Qianlong Garden. So the Qianlong Garden, it has been recently studied because there was an exhibition that many of you maybe saw. It came through several cities in the US, I think in 2012. So close to 10 years ago now, but it went through a major renovation project in the last decade and a half. So this Qianlong Garden looks like this. So on the right, you see a ground plan, and on the left, you see an axonometric view of the garden. So if we're thinking about this in terms of architecture in the Forbidden City, it's pretty interesting because it's arranged along this north-south axis, like the central axis of the Forbidden City. But the buildings are not, there's no clear path. So you can't just walk through the buildings along the central axis as you can in the main part of the city, Forbidden City, but rather you have to like twist and turn and walk around them. And that's deliberate so that you get different views, different surprises. And it also is a way to make a very small space seem a lot bigger. And this whole Qianlong Garden is in fact a very small space. So you can see that the garden comprises many different areas. The design of the garden was taken from the south, from this Jiangnan region. So I just mentioned that Qianlong toured the south. Here's a map of the cities he visited on his southern inspection tour. So you can see that he went to Yangzhou, Suzhou, and Hangzhou, which are the most famous garden cities in China. And there are records of him going to specific famous old gardens. So then he wanted, of course, his own southern garden in his palace. So he built one. When we look at these images of the Qianlong Garden, you know, it may not seem very garden-like to you. In fact, Chinese gardens, plants were not the focus of Chinese gardens. Rather, architecture and rocks were really the main two foci. So we see a lot of architecture, wonderful pavilions here, and then also fabulous rocks, and then rockeries, so big artificial kind of rock creations, fake mountains, they're called. We see the Qianlong Garden is filled with all sorts of allusions to the past, to poetry, to Confucian scholars. For instance, here we see the so-called floating cup pavilion. This references the 4th century calligrapher Wang Shizhi, who was said to float cups in a river and then drink from them when he was float cups of wine in a river and then drink from them and then get inspired to write poetry. So it conjures up these ideas of gatherings of friends and writing poetry. So this, you know, could be filled with water and then cups floated in it to recreate this event. mentioned in the writings of the 4th century calligrapher. We see many other kind of rockeries and little pavilions, and all of these buildings were filled with really wonderful works of art, a lot of Buddhist art in the Qianlong garden here. But what I want to end with is this building at the very rear of the garden. So this is called the Studio of Exhaustion from Diligent Service, or Juan Qinzhai. And it is a very unassuming building. In fact, it's not entered through the south, but rather from the east. It doesn't look like much from the outside. It was built by Qianlong as his own kind of space when he retired. So you can see in the title, studio, or the name of it, Studio of Exhaustion from Diligent Service, the sense that, you know, this was his reward for a lifetime of service. I'm going to show you a short, just a 3-minute clip of the interior of this space, just because I think otherwise it's really hard to conceptualize. So bear with me while I navigate out. And here we go. Oops.
At the northernmost end of the Qianlong Garden stands a building called Juan Qinzhai, the Studio of Exhaustion from Diligent Service. Now fully restored, this sumptuous retreat was designed by the Qianlong Emperor as a place of leisure and entertainment. Through the eastern doors, the Emperor entered a 2-story reception hall lined with partitions. A formal seating platform is framed by the partitions on the lower level. Unrestricted by finances, the Emperor commissioned China's finest artisans to use the most precious materials available in its construction. On the lower section of the partitioned panels, 100 spotted deer graze and play among gnarled pines, rocks, and waterways. Carved from the compressed inner skin of bamboo and set in relief atop dark tropical hardwood. The deer symbolize longevity, a theme appropriate to this place of peaceful retirement. More than 180 delicate silk panels decorate the partition screens in the reception hall. These exquisitely sewn silks, embellished with unique double-sided embroidery design, allow natural light to permeate the spaces behind. These panels also appear on the 2nd floor of the building, where the Emperor had several small rooms, each filled with precious artworks. Following a narrow corridor behind the partitions, the Emperor could retreat to more private spaces. The Emperor usually spent only the winter months in Juan Qinzhai. But here in his private theater, he could indulge his love of opera and music on a stage set in a never-ending summer. A bamboo fence seems to surround the room, evoking warmer regions in the south of China. So this lattice fence is made from Nammu wood, carved and painted by master artisans to look exactly like bamboo. The Emperor could look through the faux bamboo moon gate to the real garden outside. But if the wintry weather was not to his liking, he could turn his attention toward the summer scene painted in panorama on the opposite wall. An imaginary garden seems to extend the Emperor's domain miles further into distant mountains. Peering back at the Emperor through the mural's moon gate is a crane. Symbol of longevity, its graceful presence embodies one of the Qianlong Emperor's fondest wishes, a long life of worthy pursuits.
Okay, so I like that because it allows us to see the interior. Sorry, I'm having a hard time locating my cursor. It allows us to see the interior of the space.
have a sense that this was a collaborative effort,
Sorry.
just as those engravings were collaborative.
I am.
That there was a workshop style
Okay,
tradition.
having a hard time. Okay, so just to conclude, I like that film because it allows us to see the interior of the space very clearly. And in these last slides here, I just have some stills of the interior of this Zhuanchinzhai, the Studio of Exhaustion from Diligent Service, which is actually a very small space, and the interior is kind of brilliantly designed in all of these small rooms. So as you learned from the film there, you know, some of the finest materials were used to create these wonderful kind of wooden marquetry panels, and also embroidery, which is double-sided. So usually embroidery has a front and a back. Here the threads have been cleverly hidden, so there's no front and back to the embroidery. And then one of the most incredible features of this retirement villa is the great personal theater for the Qianlong Emperor. So we can see here that it's surrounded by murals, so trompe-l'oeil murals that create an extension of space. These were, Giuseppe Castiglione introduced techniques of Western perspective into the Qing court. So we see that being employed not in an extraordinary way here. The ceiling too is full of wisteria, and if you stand underneath it, as I have before, but the wisteria just hangs off the ceiling. You actually have to stand under this central one for the illusion to work, and then the wisteria just falls off the ceiling. So this is a really ingenious space and a clever space, and I think a real kind of example of Qianlong's great creative mind. So we will end here. And I know it's time, or we're at time, but I'm happy to answer any lingering questions, or we can just wrap up, whichever Kristen and Julia would like.
Thank you, Aurelia, so much. I don't see any questions that came in on this, so it might be just a good note to end on here.
That's fine.
So, okay, I have a lot of questions, but I can ask you privately. We don't need to keep everybody on it. So thank you so very much for taking the time to do this. It's really a huge pleasure to have you with us for our inaugural session. And we very much look forward to reading your book. So thank you once again for sharing time and knowledge with all of our supporters. Yeah, really wonderful. So thank you. I have a few things that, yeah, of course.
I appreciate everybody for listening. I can't see you, but thank you all for coming and listening.
Okay. Well, I have one quick announcement here, which is that our next talk with, her name is Ellen Larson. She is actually a student at Pittsburgh. She is going to be speaking on post-1989 contemporary Chinese art. So for many of the people that are on this call, they are familiar with Chinese art, but just in case, the 1989 period or post-Tiananmen period is a huge leap in terms of Chinese art and the types of art that are produced. So if you're interested in that at all, or if you're interested in just contemporary Chinese art in general, this would be a wonderful lecture for you to join. We'll send out an announcement to everyone here, but that'll be on July 16th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And once again, the discussant is Ellen Larson, and we'll be sending an announcement out to all of you. So thank you once again. This has been a really wonderful time. We're so thrilled to have the opportunity to spend our evening with you, and we thank you for doing the same. Take care and have a great time. Cheers. Stay safe.